Hello, everybody. Welcome to class. Today, we're going to be talking about qualitative research. So I realize this may not be going in sequence with the chapters. However, we're going to start out with a couple of weeks of exploring qualitative analysis. So we're jumping now to chapter 10 to discuss overall qualitative methods. Let's dive in. So when we talk about qualitative research, this is an area of doing research that has its own norms and approaches and things like that. Some people really, really like this. Other people, perhaps because of how they're trained, will gravitate towards this, as opposed to quantitative research. However, I think it's important to recognize that both approaches help to shed light on different aspects of reality, and they can both be useful depending on the context. So, as a good tool, the right tool is not necessarily, or a given tool is not necessarily always the right tool for a particular job. So depending on what you need, sometimes qualitative research may be the best tool for that job. Other times, quantitative research would be the best tool for that job. And perhaps we may have a certain inclination and towards one or the other. But that said, it's important to appreciate both and to have an understanding and training in both. So, as we talk then about qualitative methods, um, how we collect the data is very different. We may not be using, quantitative surveys. Oftentimes, it takes a really, really long time just to have interviews with people. Uh, when I did qualitative research in Bolivia, talking with people who were selling bananas or had sewing services or doing all kinds of things in the informal markets. So they had like a little desk and they had a sewing machine on that desk right out in the open. And so I'm talking to them about their use of um, microcredit or getting a loan, say, for $100 that they could then invest in their business. And so each one of these opportunities took usually like an hour or so to have these conversations, to go through a list of questions, and then to ask some follow-up questions and really kind of hear their perspective. So each, just to gather the data for one person took about an hour. And I would do that, once in the morning and then maybe once in the afternoon. And then I would write up my notes immediately after. And so then I was able to gather the information from 14 people. So this was, this is a decent number for some initial interviews, as opposed to quantitative, where we might want to get, 400 people or 2,000 people in our survey. So how we collect the data is going to be very different. What we ask, the exploratory research questions are going to be very different. We want to just simply know what's happening here. I don't know what's happening here. There might be something kind of interesting. How are people relating to each other? What's going on? And what's going on even from their perspective, and how are they interpreting it? This is not stuff that you can put a number on. And so it really kind of is oftentimes the starting point for understanding phenomena. We then have inductive reasoning, meaning that, we just kind of learn a little something and then we reason a theory maybe out of that. Um, and so, we go upwards. Maybe we focus on something that was previously unknown or unanticipated. And so then we look at kind of like what are the context? How is culture affecting this? What are some of the connections here? Before we start trying to measure them and seeing how they may, be adaptable, we just want to know what's going on in this particular case. So other elements of qualitative methods, there's a human subjectivity emphasis. As opposed to trying to get to something that's more objective, we're really saying, well, what's your truth? What are you thinking? How are you interpreting this? You being the person that I'm interviewing. Okay, so I'm the researcher, and I'll also have my own biases and thoughts and lens of how I interpret things. But then I want to know, how are you interpreting things? So there can be a real good, kind of connection between people and a meeting of minds that can be very different in terms of how we understand each other. The ideographic causal explanations, that is, kind of taken from your book. But in short, what we want to understand here is that ideographic refers to focusing on maybe getting a detailed understanding of a specific case or event, such as what's one family's experience, or what is the experience, what am I observing in this one marketplace? And so we emphasize then some of the unique aspects of these individual situations. So that's the ideographic. It's very particular to one person. This contrasts then with nomothetic, where we want to generalize principles or laws. And so we typically will do that with quantitative, where we get perspectives from a whole bunch of people, okay, across multiple cases. So basically, qualitative research is prioritizes some of the in-depth, going real deep into a person's situation to learn what we can, over finding universal rules. We'll develop those universal rules or theories later on. Those will emerge later on. Okay. And then we've got this reflexive research design where um, we'll do a little bit of research and then we'll think about it and then we'll dig a little bit deeper based on what we learned and maybe follow the rabbit holes, and keep pulling on some of these threads of like, who am I going to meet and then interview next. And then maybe, oh, you know what? It looks like a certain number of people, are using cocaine. Let me try finding more of those people and to see what their reasons are. So you keep finding, there's an iterative process. We reflect on it and then we keep moving forward. So that's very different than, say, making one research agenda and then sticking to it and not deviating from it. Here, it's a very dynamic process with qualitative research. There are several different types of methods that we can employ when we're engaging in qualitative research. One is the case study. Now, this isn't the type of case study that you might be thinking of where maybe if you've had a course with me, you've got like a little one paragraph situation, how do you do it? A case study could be like it would just be one situation, one company, one organization, one family, but it goes really, really, really in depth than looking at it from a very holistic perspective. And so looking at all of these different aspects around it. And so there would only be, say, that one company that you might be analyzing or that one organization that you're analyzing and how they have a particular type of novel intervention. And that's it for the whole paper. So you spend a lot of time getting to know that one organization and that one program. So that's a case study. When we develop a thick description, this kind of conveys what a sense of what the experience is like from the people who are engaging in it. So you're really trying to get inside their head. How are they thinking it? How are they perceiving it? What does it do for them? How do they react? So you really need to have a good command of language, not only to understand and separate yourself and your own perspectives, but to be able to provide descriptions in people's own words and to understand how they are doing it. So this is a really important part of how we do qualitative research. Then there's the ethnography. And so this could be, for instance, excuse me, it's still coffee time. The ethnography would really kind of be looking at a culture and a way that people share things and what type of in a culture that they share. Now, it's important not to kind of limit yourself. I mean, yes, it could be a culture of indigenous people in the Amazon. And so that could be, one type of ethnography where the anthropologist wants to understand these people who, have very limited contact with, the rest of Brazil or wherever it is that they're located. You then have you can have ethnographies around kind of cultures of intention. So people who participate in scouting, people who are part of a religious community, people who are maybe in a particular school, homeschooled, families. Uh, netography, excuse me, would then be using some of these ethnographic approaches to study particularly online communities, people who use Twitter, people who use Reddit, Reddit communities, these types of entities where people are coming together, they identify themselves as being members of this community. Well, what are some of the norms? How do they communicate? What types of information is being conveyed? So a lot of these kinds of things to understand how they communicate and what patterns maybe of kind of women's social justice narratives are being explored within Twitter that could not otherwise be explored within a particularly restrictive or repressive Muslim society. I don't know, maybe in the Middle East. So how are women able to express themselves as a community on Twitter? So that could be something, a use of ethnography. And then another one here is photo voice. And this is where we start getting into the role of where you're minimizing and separating who is the researcher here. And so we can actually, kind of expand that notion of who is the researcher, and we'll talk more about that later. But when we talk about, when you hand a camera to somebody else, a research participant, they then are now in control of being able to define their reality for themselves. So think back to that platinum rule. And so they construct their social reality. They take pictures of their life and or aspects of their life that are significant to whatever the research study is about, and they provide, some interpretation of what that can look like. So let's transition now into participant observation. So this is one of the things where a lot of times, and this can actually be a big difference between some of the qualitative and the quantitative. Um, you don't necessarily, with quantitative work, and you do like thousands of surveys, you don't necessarily meet every single person. Whereas with participant observation and qualitative research, you are physically observing a lot of people um, usually. So that's a big other type of difference. You're much more engaged with the people that you are studying. So, when you are determining how am I going to observe people and what's going on, who am I, and what does it mean to observe? Am I talking with them? Am I silent? So these are going to be questions that we have. So you need to figure out, well, what role am I playing in this process? And then how do I enter the field? Do I have entree? Is this a really closed community like some religious communities where they may not accept an outsider? So how do I study them? Do I try and trick them and pretend to be an insider? Do I know all of the lingo? Or, what was used in your book, somebody who was trying to get into a nursing home didn't have the credentials to be able to work in a nursing care facility. So he had to go get his credentials to become one of them. Then you've got to have people who are willing to talk to you, and that requires relationships. Now, as social workers, hopefully we're pretty good at building relationships, and we've got to develop and maintain them. So people are, even if they know we're a researcher, they got to be willing to allow us to tag along. What's in it for them? Are they getting warm fuzzies? Do they, are they willing to engage with us? If we've got a good working relationship, think about engagement at the beginning of your any type of social work intervention. Step one, engagement. So we have to develop those good relationships right from the very beginning. Then we talk about kind of address, sampling people and events. So by sampling, we mean to meet different people and to see, do they all have the same experience? How do those experiences differ? So each one would be a particular sample. Note taking. This is a big piece. So there's a lot of reflective notes, not only just kind of transcribing verbatim, if we can, all of the words that were used in the individual's own voices, but then our understanding of everything. And we might be able to jot down, some initial notes while we're in the moment, but then even, later on, we'll need to get into a much deeper notes. And so this forms part of our research data. And then we, have to manage some of these personal dimensions and how much time it takes. And do we have the time, with our own families, as well as like, how am I feeling? How is it impacting me? Am I getting some secondary trauma through this? And so ultimately, then we want to be systematic about all of this, to know what we're looking for, to determine, even then, once we've interviewed, say, I don't know, 15, 20 people, we realize, hey, you know what? Everybody's saying the same thing. I'm not learning anything new. I think we've reached this point of saturation. So this particular topic, I've learned just about everything there is to know around this idea because now I'm not learning anything more. So when we choose that initial role that we're going to play, part of this is, what we call participant observation. So they have a kind of a couple of different terms, and I've done my best to systematize it here for you, where you've got covert observation. So this would be people that you're observing do not know, so you're covert, kind of thinking like a little bit of a spy. All right, so it's covert. They don't know you're a researcher. And do you participate? Well, observation versus participation. So if you're only observing, then you're not participating. So for under covert observation, you're just simply watching very secretively in the background, trying not to be obtrusive. Um, and so when I did some qualitative research, I went to Lexington Market in downtown Baltimore. And I was just kind of curious, what are some of the types of transactions? Who are the people who are there? What's going on? And so I simply leaned against the wall in this one pillar in the middle of an area where people, there were tables and chairs where people were eating and lots of booths around where people were ordering food and so forth. And so I just simply, watched and jotted some notes down on my phone. Now, the fact that I was standing there for like a good hour, maybe hour and a half, I don't know how long I was there, just looking around and taking notes on my phone. Yeah, all right, it's possible people saw me and they were getting a little suspicious, but whatever. Then you have, but I wasn't engaging with them. I wasn't talking to them, and nor did I tell them that I was a researcher. I was just wearing my whatever clothes and being there on my phone. Then you've got overt or complete observation, where this could be something like the old school anthropologist who kind of goes into a community of folks in the Amazon, and he's studying this tribal community. They know clearly that he's there. maybe he, introduced himself and said, "Hey, I'm a researcher. I'm just going to hide out here and hang out here, excuse me, in the corner. I'm just going to scribble my notes. Just go about your daily life." So they know that he's the researcher. Um, Clearly, he's there, but he's not participating in anything. He's just observing and watching how things are going. Then another type is overt participation, where, yeah, they know you're a researcher, but you're also running around with them. So, a good example of this, I don't know how many of you have read the book Evicted by Matthew Desmond. Highly, highly recommend it. It took me a while to actually read it because the first half of it was actually describing my job as, in doing eviction prevention in Baltimore City, very similar type of community and cultural groups and dynamics. And so it was a little traumatic for me to read this because I'm like reading about my job and it's very triggering in that way. But I did get through it. Highly recommend it. Really, really good. Um, but in this case, he's a student. I think he's working on his dissertation, at this time. And he's running around town with all of these different people. He's like hanging out with the landlords. He's hanging out with the people who are getting evicted. He's got friendships. He's living in the community. I think like a couple of the people have actually become really good friends with him. They know he's a researcher. They know that he's doing this research and they let you tag along. And so he's, hanging out with them and just doing what he does with them. And so he becomes, in a way, sort of part of the family. So he does participate in those activities. Then there's covert participation. This one technically can be unethical, but a lot of times there's no other way that one could possibly get the research data otherwise. So this is where, for instance, you're infiltrating an extremist group, trying to find out what is this, how does this hate group, uh, you know, how do they think? Who are members of it? What are some of the dynamics? Who's the leader? What are some of the leadership things that are going on there? And so you participate, to an extent, but you don't tell them who you are. And you're hoping that you're fitting in well. So you've got to really act the part of being a member that they then accept you as a member. So that is kind of the fourth one. I would actually recommend that you look at your book 10.3, which has a kind of a good illustration around being at a protest and these different roles and how your thinking may go and how you may approach it in that context. So this is really kind of, depending on what role you want to take, that will then determine how you enter the field and how you develop and maintain relationships. For covert participation, you're telling people, "Hey, I'm one of you." Um, but for overt observation, you might maintain a little bit of a relationship, but not much. You really kind of want to stay out of it because you don't want to influence their what they do and how they think and what they say. Even though, I mean, there are certain scientific principles that say the moment that you observe something, there's going to be a change. So now, as we're going about collecting the data, this is our participant observation. We want to, as I mentioned earlier, we want to kind of sample different people and events. So, we'll talk to different people, we'll hear their stories, but we don't do this in a very random way. Instead, we want to do, say, a theoretical sampling. And so this is where, when we're out in the field, we're doing our research, we're doing it in a very sequential fashion, with settings or individuals. Based on earlier observations that indicate that these settings or individuals are particularly influential. And so, we find out where are the relationships, what are some of the things, who are the people who are observing this. Now let's go get more of those people who might actually be able to give us deeper insight into what we're understanding. rather than just talking to a random person on the street. We are very intentional about who it is that we talk to. Then, when when we're engaging then in taking notes, we might just jot down certain things, like I was jotting down on my phone when I was in Lexington Market. Those were jottings. These are some of the highlights, and just kind of like maybe some trigger phrases of things that I'm seeing. Then I go home and I spend, maybe an hour, another hour writing up everything that I observed. So while it's fresh, that's really, really important. I write up everything that I observed. I use my notes, and so my jottings, excuse me, to then flesh out the big, thick field notes. And personally, I found it really important to do that after every time before then I went and did another one. So, for instance, when I was in Bolivia, um, before I went out to do another one, I would have to write up all of my notes because otherwise people's messages and what they're saying starts getting all mixed up. And you want to be able to keep it very clear and distinct who's saying what. And then, managing, as I mentioned, the personal dimensions. And so, to what extent am I bringing myself into this process? To what extent are they influencing my thinking? And then ultimately the systematic observation. So just as you need to be very systematic about your literature review and keeping all of your articles organized, this systematic observation where we increase the reliability of this data of what we're using very standardized coding practices across observers. So, we might, if we're keeping it blind, we give each person a very distinct number and then associate who said what quote, is, making sure that we're associating that with the right ID number. Um, and then also, a lot of times we will then we'll have a partner that we work with, and they will then also go through the data and determine, okay, is this person seeing the same thing? So, so there's different types of coding practices that we can use for all of that. When we do intensive interviews, so this is not the let's see here, covert observation. And for instance, in covert observation, one very famous study was a guy who wanted to understand men who have sex with men. And in particular, going into a public bathroom in the city. And so he was just simply observing. Um, he wasn't interviewing anyone. He didn't want them to know that he was there watching them because then they wouldn't show up. But he would trail them and find out, oh, hey, they are married, heterosexual men, live in the suburbs. And yet they're also engaging in these practices. Huh, that's interesting. Um, but that would be a different type. Here, we're talking now about intensive interviewing. And so here we're actually engaging with the person in a very detailed, going deep, having an hour-long conversation with them. And so here we have, maybe a couple of starter questions that we ask, but these are generally open-ended questions. Tell me about this. What's been your experience with that? And so we're exploring their feelings, their perceptions. Do you feel that you're better off? Do you feel that you're worse off? How do you feel? How do you feel that this has impacted your life? How do you feel that it's impacted your business? These were questions that I asked these informal market folks. And it's important that you ask really good questions that are not leading questions. So I should not say, are you better off? Because then it'd be like, yes, I am better off, because I've now implied that there is a better off, as opposed to, how are you doing? Okay. And so that's something a little bit more neutral, which allows them to identify, how is my business? Um, has it improved? Has it not improved? So we want to, as we explain ourselves, we develop these relationships. So remember, engage. Then, asking questions, recording answers, making sure that you've, heard things correctly. So we want to be sensitive. We want to let them know, hey, this is going to be confidential. State our purpose, be respectful of their time, and the location. So, make sure that it's a place where they can talk freely. And remember, they're doing you a favor. So, they don't need to talk to you. So, to the extent that you can make them feel comfortable, that's really important. So you should have established questions and then be flexible to follow up and dig deeper. Um, it's also important, because these are going to be really long conversations, you can jot down your notes, but you also want to record on, they say a tape recorder in the book, but oftentimes now it's just a digital device. So it could be on your phone, or it would be maybe like an MP3 recording device that you can use and actually not have to worry about the amount of space on it. You'd have ample space, and it's independent and secure. It's not connected to the internet, so it can't be hacked until, but then you'd have to, keep it secure and so forth. So that is one of the ways in which we can go about it. There's other type, and that intensive interviewing is usually over, what happens when you are face to face. But you can also engage in that when you're online. However, that said, these online interviews, yeah, depending on, sometimes you're able to access people in other areas of the country. So potentially you can meet more people than are simply available to you in your own immediate network. Um, at the same time, you can do a closed captioning and recording of the interview, and it can immediately transcribe it, like this recording is happening. Uh, at the same time, however, you don't get all of the nuanced, forms of communication. You get words, but you don't necessarily get all of the, kind of the verbal things. It's a little, some of these little gestures and physical intimacy that can come, and vibes from the other person. Now, when you're, doing a video conference, you get more of them than you would say with a phone call, and certainly more than you would with an email. But it's still not the same as being in person. So you've got to make a choice here between, different types of interviews, and they're simply different. Online chatting and texting, or maybe video conference. So that can be more of the synchronous or asynchronous. Are you, kind of just mining some of these online forums, sending emails, chatting with people within Reddit subgroups, or things like that? Then another one is a focus group. So particularly for those of you who may be interested in working with groups, this could be helpful. It's also really good for evidence-based participatory, or excuse me, evidence-based research, and to develop evidence-based practices. So focus groups are, as is implied, you're not just talking to one individual one-on-one. Instead, you're looking and working with a whole group. When I was working on my initial first master's degree, I had two focus groups that I worked with. And so this is, you have maybe a couple of questions just to get the group going, and then the group dynamic takes over. And so you're more of a moderator with some good facilitation skills. And you're concerned that everybody gets a point, gets a chance to share their points, and people will crosstalk, and they'll feed off of each other. And so there's an active participation among everybody who's there based on that topic of interest, and having their input. So some people will talk more and other people will talk less, but this is a big part of how it can go. And it's a way of getting a large amount of data from a larger number of people in one shot. And so it's an opportunity for them to kind of like feed off of each other. Now, there's another, aspect here called community-based participatory research, or CBPR, as it's known. It's not exclusively a qualitative approach, because it can also be very much use quantitative data. However, for those of us, within social work, social justice and equity and dignity are really important principles, and that goes for you as a social work researcher as well. And so this is a much more collaborative approach to engaging in research where the community members, um, are perhaps both participants and research partners with you. So they can be involved from the very beginning of determining what is our research question? What do we want to study? What do we want to get out of this? And then they work with you and they help to decide, okay, what are going to be some of the questions that we'll ask ourselves, as well as then other people in our community. And then ultimately down to how do we interpret this data because they are coming from that community, so they have a good idea of what that looks like, and how to interpret it and how to understand it, even to then the point of, writing up the results and who are those results shared with? Is it just going to one publication that they don't have access to, or are they able to maybe take slideshows into the community and to design new interventions that then help benefit themselves? So, who benefits is also a big part of this. So, this is a much more inclusive approach to research. And a lot of times it can be really helpful for working with, very diverse populations, especially if you're not a member of that population. As well as then at-risk folks to help them have more control over the process and how they may benefit and to avoid harm from. Now, these qualitative research, as I mentioned, this is a way of empowering people to speak for themselves, to speak their own truths, to give their own subjective perspectives. Um, and then, from that, it allows, kind of new perspectives to arise that may be very different or contrary to the dominant cultural narrative in the area. So it allows new voices to actually be heard. Uh, and from that, it then helps us to develop theory and to develop approach and to point out and say, okay, now that we understand that this perspective exists and that this dynamic exists, how many people are actually participating in it? Then we can use that as a foundation for our quantitative research to then see how many people are experiencing this, using a couple of key questions to really kind of get at the essence of it, in terms of, kind of figuring out and modeling then what it all looks like. So it serves as that foundation for a quantitative research where then we sample a much larger number of people, but at a much more superficial level. So as I mentioned earlier, this has big implications for evidence-based practice. EBP is evidence-based practice, where we want to maybe work with an organization and they want to know, is this working? We're trying something novel here. Or perhaps they've gotten a grant from an organization and that grant now needs the intervention that grant was supporting now needs to be evaluated. So you need to come in, perhaps as an outside independent evaluator, to then measure and see, how is this working? So this is actually a big job that social work researchers or professors can do, alongside community organizations and ways in which we can partner together. So, we assess the design and the delivery and the effectiveness of these services, to see how is it working? Are people getting better? Why are people engaging in it? Why are they not engaging in it? So We want to be able to kind of explore some of these questions of what's happening, how is it working, what's not working, how do we improve it? So you can use focus groups, you can, do interviews with actual clients, you can maybe find people who have had similar experiences but have decided not to use the agency's approach, find out from them why don't they want to use it. So all of these things can be helpful here. And ultimately, yes, there are ethical issues depending on how deep a person goes. Sometimes they even lose perspective, and of themselves as a researcher because they get so caught up in the lives of the people that they're running around with that they start doing some unethical things. And they may, kind of have lapses in their impartiality and in their objectivity. So, so that's, kind of an ethical issue on the part of the researcher. But then you also have, ethical issues on the part of the participant. So ultimately, people should, be able to volunteer and to say, no, I don't want you here in my house. Um, and especially when, research subjects are giving lots of confidential information, or especially if, you're working with at-risk children and maybe the parents don't want you hanging around with their children. Um, so, this is really important. And I think it's also, important for you to recognize that, there's the amount of time that you're spending with people, or hours, days, months, sometimes even years, as opposed to a 15-minute survey. You know, Oftentimes people are not going to be harmed by a real quick survey, but there can be a lot of emotional attachment and harm for when you're engaging with a family over a long, long period of time. Ultimately, then, we want to focus on emphasizing and prioritizing, the subject's well-being. Are they being helped? Are we being confidential? Or are we, disclosing something that could be criminal activity? And so to what extent are they willing to allow us that? And we need to disclose our own identity so that way people are fully informed of who we are and what role that we're playing. So these are some of those ethical issues. Um, Alrighty, and so that this is your overview of qualitative research. We'll have a couple more lectures on this, and so stay tuned, and I'll see you again soon.